Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Spear, and I'm both a linguist and a teacher by training. By profession, I'm an assistant professor of English and linguistics at Florida A&M University and an invited professor of linguistics at Universidad San Francisco de Quito in Ecuador. As a continuation of the workshop on special education to the Maestría en Enseñanza de Inglés como Segundo Idioma, I have the distinct privilege and honor to speak today with Mrs. Evelyn Onopa, who, by virtue of being a veteran teacher of special education with over 30 years of experience, was also responsible for my twin brother's education in middle school. So without further ado, welcome, Mrs. Onapa. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, Troy. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you and your audience.
Well, it's a real privilege, as I mentioned, for me because I have very fond memories of coming to your classroom and seeing the way that you interacted with my brother, and of course, all of the other students as well. But at least from my perspective, it left such a lasting impact on me. So I'm so pleased to be able to speak with you today.
Wonderful. I love to hear that.
Excellent. Well, so I was hoping that we might be able to begin by having you tell me, and rather tell us, a little bit more about yourself. So who are you? Where are you from? What and where did you study?
Okay. Well, as just Troy told you, my name is Mrs. Evelyn Onopa. I was born in a small town near Pittsburgh. We moved to Bethlehem, my family and I, and then I went on to college in Millersville. I attended Millersville State College, which is now Millersville State University, and that's where I met my husband. And I've resided in Reading, Pennsylvania ever since that time. I studied 4 years at Millersville. My major was a dual certification at the time. That was back in the 1970s. I received a degree in elementary education certification K through 6, and also a dual certification in special education K through 12. And that included all disabilities at that time. I taught for 34 years. During that time, I was also a department chair for 20 years, the secondary special education at Ole Valley School District. And I did pursue a master's degree at Kutztown University. I began that in 1982, finished in 1986. And that was a reading specialist certificate. So that was very useful to tie that in with my special ed degree.
Well, that sounds really exciting. I knew about the teaching. I didn't know that
Mhm.
you also had the administrative component, that you were department chair.
I did do that. Yes, that was just something that they finally allowed special education to have a department chair. For years, special ed had no department chair. Every other subject had one, and finally, probably I would guess in the 90s is when special ed moved up the ladder enough to be included to have a department chair. So that was a big deal.
Wow. Well, that sort of leads us into the second question. You've sort of
Mhm.
jumped the
Mm,
gun here. So you mentioned that you taught for 34 years. I'm
yes.
wondering maybe if you can describe for us a little bit about how the field has changed, perhaps both during your time as a teacher and or as an administrator.
Right. All right. First of all, I have a lot of time in special education, not only as a teacher, but also before I got into the field. I did in high school, I volunteered at Allentown State Hospital. So I had some involvement there was when I was in my late teens, early teens. And I also took care of our next door neighbor's child who had cerebral palsy and intellectual disabilities. And I did some things with Park, which was involved with mentally challenged adults. So I did some things before I went on to school. Things really changed from the time I started in special education, which was in college. I started college in 1974. And during that time, some of the key legislation had not yet been passed in the United States. Special education in the 1970s and previously, maybe from the 1950s on, so that was during my lifetime.
Mhm.
Kids were not in school a lot of times. They were home, especially if they were severely handicapped. A lot of times they were not at home, especially in the 1950s when I was a very young girl, which I do remember kids that were home. They just were on the sofa. They were not included in school. In the 1970s, during my first job,
Mhm.
I was teaching at East Penn School District, which was near Allentown, Pennsylvania. And my first assignment was a self-contained kindergarten through 6 EMR classroom, labeling the children educable mentally retarded. The kids were with me all day long. They did not go out. They went out for specials, gym class. However, they were all together for gym class. They did not integrate with the rest of the kids. Our class, they were together as a group. They did not integrate. There was no mainstreaming at that time. Then I went on to my second placement. When I got married, I moved to Reading, and I was hired at the Berks County Intermediate Unit, which was run through the state of Pennsylvania. And that job was different than my first job because it was a learning support classroom where the kids were in with me part of the day and then they were mainstreamed out. And even at that time, which was in 1979, when I started that second placement, I was only in my first job for 1 year. I was a long-term substitute. Let me clarify that. And then I went up for my second placement. And at that second job in the learning support classroom, mainstream was just getting started
Okay.
because of Public Law 94-142, which was a big federal law. And the kids were not accepted. The people did not want these kids in their classroom. In fact, I still remember very clearly the one teacher standing in the hall saying, "I don't want those kids in my classroom." They were very used to having them out. They were in their room, they stayed there. But the trend was to get the kids integrated with the other students where they were capable.
Okay.
So I got in education right at the beginning of that, right at the beginning of writing IEPs. It remained that way throughout my whole career, writing the IEPs, inclusion, putting the children in with regular ed. The trend was to do as much inclusion as possible by the time I retired, which was 10 years ago. The trend was to do, if possible, full inclusion with the kids. Sometimes an aide would go into the classroom with kids that needed more assistance. Sometimes I would go into the classroom and co-teach with the regular ed teachers. That was also a new trend that was beginning. The paperwork part, though, the IEPs that were being written, which drive all the programs of all the students, those were written by me.
Mm-hmm.
The special ed teacher is in charge of generating that paperwork and making sure that it's distributed to all administrators, teachers, parents, nurses, speech therapists, whoever has to get a copy of the IEP, that special ed teacher is in charge of that. So I really saw the field change from completely self-contained classroom to full integration of the students into the regular ed program.
Well, and I find that really interesting because you said you retired about 10 years ago, and or it's been a couple years since I was in the K-12 classroom, but it was about 10
Mhm,
years ago that I started. And I remember I had a high school English class. There was an aide in there
mhm,
who worked specifically with two of the students who were in there because
mhm.
the district decided that that was preferable to having them in a separate room.
Right.
What I'm really curious about, though, is if I can ask you to speculate a little bit. You said that there was a teacher who you remember
Mhm.
vividly screaming, I don't want these kids. Do you think that this student, or excuse me, this teacher was sort of an exception? Or do you think that most teachers sort of saw students with disabilities as being maybe problematic for the mainstream classroom?
Well, at that time, back when the mainstreaming was just getting started, the teachers saw it as very problematic.
Okay.
There were no aides available to really go into the rooms to give them any assistance at all.
Okay.
The kids were in there. I did have the ability to adapt materials for the kids. However, a lot of teachers pushed back on that. They felt that wasn't fair.
Mm.
They felt that wasn't correct. Um, the IEPs have come a long way, and explaining things to the regular ed teachers and training them has come a long, long way. There's both good and bad to that.
So do you think that those teachers felt like the material shouldn't have any modifications because students with disabilities should be held to the same standard?
Right. They felt that if the kids were mainstreamed into their classrooms, they should be held accountable to do exactly what the other kids are doing with
Even
no
if
modifications, right? And
even if
that was
it leads to
when,
failure?
right, even if it would have. They weren't really familiar with modifying materials at the time. Now, some teachers were really just happy that I was available to, you know, read the test to the kids if they would allow me to do that. I mean, there was a lot of friction early on, exactly what was going to be allowed to be done with the kids when they were mainstreamed into a regular class. I can recall some things that happened that it made a lasting impression on me, and unfortunately on lower functioning students who did their very best at what they did. We would help them with the work, for example, writing a report that would be due, helping them do the research, put it together. And this is when they hand wrote things before they typed them, even, and having the child do a really good job, because we proofread it, we'd help them get it together, do a nice cover, they'd turn it in, and then the teacher would fail them because it was something that they didn't say was up to snuff. That happened several times, but that, luckily to say, that was the exception.
Okay.
But the few instances that it would happen, to see the kids' frustration. So really, that has come a long way, because that kind of thing really, when the kids are putting forth their best effort, and it is according to their educational plan,
Mhm.
and the regular ed teachers are now included in the IEP meetings. They sit there and hear what's being discussed. They also receive a copy of the IEP. They
Right.
know what their responsibility is, what my responsibility is, what the child's responsibility is. It's more of a team effort now. So it makes it more clarified for everyone. Early on, it was so new. It was a rough road all the way
Right.
around.
And I can't imagine things are perfect now, but it seems like in the early days, it was a very sort of demoralizing effort for both the educator and for the students who are the ones
Mhm.
receiving these early services.
It
Whereas
was.
now, of course, it's not perfect, but it seems more collaborative. There are more people.
Exactly. Exactly. And early on, um, there weren't many special ed teachers in the Ole Valley when I started in that district, which you're very familiar with how
Right.
special ed teachers are there now. Early on, there was one high school special ed teacher who was my mentor. It was a man that was just wonderful with special ed. He just turned 80. I was in the middle school,
Mhm.
the only one, and then there was one teacher in the elementary school. So, early on, um, probably 5 years before I actually got in that building, self-contained classrooms that was the standard.
Right.
Kids with all types of disabilities, didn't matter what it was, they were just put into one big room. That was their classroom, that was their place. And then right around the time I started is when the mainstreaming began.
Well, that to me at least seems like a great transition here. So
Mhm,
the primary viewers of this special education workshop are teachers in training in Ecuador, and
mhm.
they've been asking for a while now to get some formal instruction in this area because even though there's legislation, and frankly, there's been legislation for a few decades to
Right.
support full inclusion or mainstreaming efforts, it doesn't seem to be borne out very widely in the schools, and the teachers aren't receiving a lot of training. So,
Mhm.
what I'm wondering is from your point of view, and we can talk the past, we can talk more recently, but what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions concerning the teaching of students with disabilities or about special education more broadly?
Some of the misconceptions, I believe, and some of them still hold true today because I would still hear that faculty say they would look at a child, the kid looks completely normal, but they have a learning disability, they might have a lesser intellectual ability, they might have something else going on, and that some of the teachers go, "Yeah, right." That type of a not understanding what's really going on with the kid, with the child, especially if there were maybe some discipline issues going on, even minor ones.
Mm.
But if you can get those issues worked out with the regular ed teacher, and especially if the student's enthusiastic about wanting to be in the class, I mean, it can work out so much better. And I think what your teachers are facing, with trying to get things going, and it is very difficult. It takes time.
Mhm.
I would say anything they could get going is a big plus, even if it's a one self-contained classroom where the kids are of all types, any type of child that might need extra help or needs something where they can't be successful in regular education. If there's just a place they can go in that building
Right.
and there's someone in there that can offer them some type of help or accommodation, you've done, you've done, you're the key. You're the key to that child being successful. So even if you're starting just with that, that's huge. That's a huge step in the right direction. And to keep that going. I did read your entire outline that was online, and I did see that legislation has been uh, in the works
Mm.
in Ecuador. Yeah, I wouldn't worry so much. This is my feeling. I wouldn't worry so much about the legislation and the paperwork. It's more important right now because that takes time to get that going. That's just the way it is. It's more
Right.
important, in the individual districts. And it seems like districts, I did catch that some districts have started some things
Mhm.
just to get some things going, get some things going, show some successes, then maybe get some key people in to observe what's being done and get them involved. Some people that have some pull and get funding. And once you get some good programs going and people see the success, they're going to want to do more because it is such a positive thing.
Well, and I love this idea that the teachers, especially those who are teachers in training, can be the
Mhm.
key
Oh,
to
exactly.
student success because
Mm.
you've hit two of our big topics from the workshop here, and I think the very first one, perhaps the most important, is to focus on the person first, not on the disability.
Right.
And so I won't name any names, but I remember working at a district a couple years ago where I would be sitting eating lunch with the other faculty members, and they would talk about particular students being dumb as bricks.
Mm.
And it always rubbed me the wrong way because I knew that many of these students had an IEP and others, one in particular, had undiagnosed dyslexia. And so this is, of course, not my area. I'm not a special education teacher. I am a novice when it comes to special ed, but I do know language usage. And so I remember making a recommendation to somebody in a position just like yours who said, "Thanks for catching this," because this is the kind of student who might otherwise have just been passed along. So I really
It
like
was
that
really
idea. Yeah, it made me
Mm.
feel pretty good because that student was able to get the help that he needed to be on a level playing field with everyone else. And the second part that I really like, that whether you realize it or not, you tacitly suggested here, is that even though the labels are meaningful, that the labels are not an excuse. So it's not fair to say that this student has behavioral issues because of this
Mhm.
particular learning disability, for instance, or a student acts a certain way or needs these kinds of accommodations only because this person is lesser than the other student. So I really love that line about teachers being the key to student success.
Right. Well, good. I'm glad you can appreciate that.
Oh, definitely. And even though I've been in the post-secondary classroom for a few years now, it's been a couple years since I was at the K-12 level, I've never been
Mhm.
full-time in a special ed classroom. And so
Mhm.
I'm wondering if you can describe for us what a typical day looked like in that room. Were there certain things that were more difficult or that were easier than others? What would a
Mm.
day look like in the life of Mrs. Onapa teaching special ed?
Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about my time in the middle school because that's that's where I spent the majority of my years with sixth, seventh, and eighth graders. So first of all, I would say always get there a little bit earlier or as much earlier as you can, as your family can permit you to get there earlier, um, because you need to be very organized. You need to be set up before the kids get in your room. Have the materials ready for them, know your schedule for the day, know what's going on. I would get in there early, read my email before the kids get there because that takes up so much time. Go through your mail and just try to get some things out of the way before the kids get there.
Okay.
Because once they get there, I mean, your day is busy. You're busy all day long, and uh, knowing the kids, knowing the students really well. If there's, any psychologicals you have permission to read, which you should be able to. If you ever have a student that you're really having difficulty with, and there's something that you really just, you just can't figure out exactly what's going on. If there is a school psychologist that has a psychological, you might want to read through that or speak to them. There might be something going on there that somebody just didn't catch
Okay.
or that you don't know, and it could be help you out with working more with that student. Knowing the kids reading levels is a really big deal. I mean, I to me that was because I am also certified in reading. Sometimes you get information about their reading level, but you really don't get what grade level they're on,
Okay.
and that's huge. You might have to have a reading specialist test the kids. You might be able to find that score. Um, you know, if they just say below grade level, that's really not good enough. If you're
Mhm.
trying to teach them to read, sometimes they'll say below grade level. You'll have a student that might be in, and I'm speaking of middle school, they might be in sixth grade where they're reading on a second grade level. Well, that's a big difference from below grade level. You're thinking,
Right.
oh, fifth grade, well, no way, it's down there lower, which that does happen.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so just being very organized throughout the day. Get to know the other teachers in the building. Go out and if your kids are mainstreamed into those classes, make sure you get to know them. Make sure if you're going to work with those teachers with inclusion,
Mhm.
make sure you know what their outlines are, their syllabus would be for the topic. Look for the positive people on the staff. I have to tell people that's something that I did. So the typical day is busy. I'm just kind of mentioning things that I did just to get my classroom going for the year.
Mhm.
But then when the day would start and you get there early, you get set up, um, following the regular schedule that the other teachers are following. The bell schedule. You might have a homeroom, you might have a club.
Mhm.
You do fire drills with them. Um, the day goes busy. You have 8 periods in the day. You have a planning period where you're allowed to hopefully get some things run off on the printer. If your printed materials are coming out somewhere else, you might have time to do that. And then when you wrap the day up and make sure the kids are all ready to go home.
Mhm.
If there's some that come back in your homeroom and they have to get their homework ready, that's your responsibility. And yeah, that's a typical day. And it's just a very busy day.
So in terms
Did
of
I answer that question well enough?
You did. I'm gonna push you a little bit though. So in terms of sort of getting your hands dirty, you
Mhm.
mentioned earlier in our conversation here that one sort of accommodation that might be offered to a student is reading a text aloud or reading a test aloud. So
Right.
in terms of sort of getting
Mhm.
down in the trenches, what would
Mhm.
that day look like? What kind of accommodations would you be providing, or what kind of modifications might you be preparing? Just sort
Mhm.
of as some general suggestions here for our viewers.
Well, okay, first of all, I guess every IEP was different. There were some, um, accommodations that were pretty easy to do, like giving the kids, extended test time because you
Mhm.
didn't have to change the test, or giving them a quiet area to work in. Some of the kids, they did better if they would come to the testing room or to my room where maybe there were less kids in the room, so they'd have a quiet area.
Okay.
But if you have to modify their work, for example, if the kids have a math test
Mhm.
and they are to receive lesser problems to do, you have to get that test from the teacher ahead of time,
Okay.
and you have to look at it. And usually, I would have been the one to go through and choose the problems that they should do. And you want to give a good sampling of the problems, so you have to be aware of what the math class is like.
Okay.
Especially in middle school because they're getting into some algebra and geometry and different types of math. It's a little more challenging. Um, if it's a test that the kids are reading,
Mhm.
and one of the modifications where you actually change the material is that they have less material to read. You have to get that test ahead of time and make sure that that you have less of the answers questions chosen for the student ahead of time. And once the regular ed teachers do receive the IEPs ahead of time, and with years of practice, now that they understand the IEPs, they should go to the modifications section, accommodations and modification. That's the key part in
Okay.
the IEP, and the teachers should read that and make sure in their class they know what needs to be done with the IEP students.
So you sort of need to be an expert in special education pedagogy, the legislation,
Oh, exactly.
and all of the content areas.
That's true.
So you're
That is
basically a
that's true.
superhero.
A what?
A superhero.
I guess you could say that. I don't know. And it takes a while to get into that. Takes a while to get into that. I mean, you go in there as a new teacher, you're going to feel overwhelmed.
Right.
Just give it time. You need to. The biggest thing as a new teacher, especially a special ed teacher, and I don't know what kind of paperwork the special ed teachers in Ecuador are given.
Mhm.
Are every district is different. Um, if there is paperwork, I know you need to get a hold of it and look at it and make sure you have it in your hands. And once you do that, then just get to know those students. Get the year going. Uh, if they are in regular ed classes, touch base with those teachers beforehand
Okay.
and look at the paperwork and know what before you go in there. Make sure you know the paperwork. Make sure you have some knowledge about that student. And if you're new, the other teachers, I'm sure that they'll tell you. Once you have the kids' schedules and you go meet with them, I'm sure they'll fill you in on anything that you might need to know. So make sure you take a piece of paper, take some notes.
Mhm.
Don't be afraid to get a good old fashioned piece of paper and a pencil when you go somewhere. Write down what people tell you. Don't think you're going to remember it all. I mean, if they start telling you things, make sure you remember because once the kids get there, it's so busy,
Right.
and they might give you some little tidbit of information that you really could use.
Well, I think you beat me to my final question here. I was going to ask if you could offer a class or a workshop to teachers in training, or
Mhm.
perhaps current teachers about special education specifically. What kind of tips or advice would you give? And what I'm taking away from you at this point is that relationships really are number one. Relationships with
Mhm.
those students, relationships with the other faculty members, because presumably without that communication, you can't be, as you mentioned, that key to student success. But I'm wondering, just very briefly, do you have any other kind of advice or tips that we might be able to share with up and coming or current teachers in Ecuador?
Sure. Well, the one thing, like I said, which I think is really important, find positive people to work with, because you're going to need each other in difficult times, to bounce ideas off of each other and just help each other through any difficult situation you might encounter during the school year. Another big thing, which I know because I was older when I retired and I started keep up with technology. When technology starts changing, make sure that you take any in-service time or whatever you can do on your own time to make sure you know how to work anything new that you might be required to use in your classroom, because the technology is very helpful in a classroom. And you don't really have time to figure it out too much when the kids are all sitting there looking at it. You have to make sure you know how to work it.
Right.
Um, and another thing, I did take some notes here. Uh, give yourself time when you start a new job, when you start teaching. Like you're going to go in there, and it's just so much that you have got to learn, so much that you're responsible for, and you have all those people, all those kids sitting there looking at you. You're going to get really nervous, but just give yourself time. The first year is a challenge. And I told some people this: give yourself 5 years. After 5 years, and I really felt like, you really knew the system really well. And that might seem funny. 5 years is a long time, but other people said the same thing. Yeah, after 5 years, you just, maybe administrators changed or teachers changed, but if you were in the same school, you kind of knew, you felt like you really, really understood more, and it made it a lot easier. So I hope that's helpful. You have an opportunity to go out and visit other classrooms, like on an in-service day, and see what other teachers are doing. That's also very helpful to get some new ideas.
I love that, especially the 5-year suggestion. It does seem like a
Mhm.
long time, but I feel like I could teach freshman composition in my sleep because I've taught it so many
There
times at
you
this point.
go. Yay, that's a big, big accomplishment.
Right, right, and somebody's gotta teach it, so I am that
Exact-
somebody.
Exactly.
Well, excellent. We are pretty close to the very end here, so I just wanted to
Good.
take
Okay.
a moment here to thank you, Mrs. Onapa. This has been, for me, very rewarding personally and professionally because I feel like each time we talk, I learn a little bit more about you and your background, but also I think that this has been very enriching for me as a reminder, as a review of what I need to do as an educator, but also for our viewers who might be for the very first time really considering what it means to differentiate instruction, not only for
Mhm.
students in their classes with disabilities, but perhaps for all students. So thank you
Perhaps.
very much for taking your valuable time today to have this conversation and share your advice with us.
But thank you, Dr. Spear. I appreciated it very much. It was wonderful talking to your audience, and I wish all of you the best of luck in your classrooms.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.